In my talk this morning still, I would like to talk about how governments in Canada and Australia work alongside security or intelligence agencies and the private sector to spy on and infiltrate environmental organisations who are trying to sort of on the front line, I guess, of trying to push us into better environmental goals. Both of all these organisations really target what they call critical infrastructure projects. In Canada, in your context, looks like gas and oil developments. In the Australian context, it focuses much more on coal, which is a dinosaur that we just can't seem to get rid of in Australia. Both of our countries have multiple security agencies, but in the Canadian context, I'm going to focus on the Canadian Security Intelligence Services and a little bit on the Royal RNPC. Yeah. And in the Australian context, ASIO, or the Australian Security and Intelligence Organisation. For obvious reasons, I won't be touching on very much on North America. There was on the United States. There was a report in the Washington Post from 2010, which says that in the US there is something like 1,200 intelligence organizations and something like 1,900 private security organizations that do this kind of work. So it's just far too big to get a real sense of. There is, of course, absolutely nothing new about intelligence organizations spying on and infiltrating protest groups of different stripes. Even years ago, when I was involved in a group called Friends of the Earth, we had federal police pose as activists and protesters in our organisation. So there's nothing new about this. But what is new, and I guess what I want to focus on, is developments in that environmentalists are increasingly characterised as terrorists. The work that characterisation is, well, not new, certainly emerging and gaining steam. And there's also relationships which intelligence services or government organisations are building with private security firms. So that relationship between the public and the private is, I think, quite unnerving. And I think when you put those two things together, they counter any, well, they're certainly an illegitimate function. That's what I will be arguing. These developments, so characterising environmentalists as terrorists and the relationships that security services are building with the private sector, are also occurring alongside of a whole range of things, which is silencing protest and political activism in Australia and Canada. This includes things like legislation which explicitly bars protest. It looks like public spaces being converted into private spaces, which narrows the kinds of places protests can occur. It looks like government withdrawing funding from state or federal bodies, even removing the gift deductible status, which NGOs have previously enjoyed. And Australia is currently very much and very deliberately following Canada along this path right at the moment. So if you look at those things in isolation, it's just one problem after another. But if you put them all together, you start to get a bit of a picture of quite a deliberate and sustained attack on civil society, on popular protest, and really hampering our ability to push forward the kinds of changes that we really need. Ideally, in a talk like this, I would want to talk about the history of these organisations as such a long and interesting history of illegitimate targeting of protest groups that Canada and Australia have both been involved in. And I would want to talk about the kinds of security apparatuses that have grown up post 9/11, because that's fundamental to the context we're operating in. But I want to, because I have a short amount of time, probably 12 minutes or so left, I'm going to talk about Canada and Australia and try to give you some specific concrete examples of the kinds of things I'm talking about. The kind of research that I'm conducting at the moment, and it's with peers in Australia and people involved in campaigns, is still very much in its infancy. But in Canada, there is a reasonably sophisticated body of work that not only documents specific cases of spying and infiltration, But I think equally importantly, tries to understand the networks that government has with the private sector and does a lot of that mapping work. So you can really clearly see the terrain in the picture. This is, of course, very difficult research to do, primarily because the information that's being sought to make these connections is secret or private, protected under freedom of information laws, and so forth. But some of the best research that I've seen in Canada is coming from people you may know, Geoffrey Monahan, who's at Carleton University, and his colleague Kevin Walby, who's at the University of Winnipeg, doing really interesting work in this space, if anyone knows Jeff or Kevin. A really crucial term which Monahan and Walby use in conducting their research is the idea of critical infrastructure protection. And as I said, this could be oil, this could be gas, or in Australian context, this looks like coal. For the authors, Monahan and Walby, any legitimate threat to critical infrastructure attracts the attention of security services. What constitutes a legitimate threat? It could include, but is not limited to, property damage or threats of violence. They're the kinds of things we would probably expect would attract the attention of intelligence agencies. But it's more than that. It includes protests where participants trespass onto areas, so kind of a low-level law breaking, where people blockade, where people lock on to equipment, or, and this is perhaps the most mild form of protest, where a protest is sufficiently successful to gather enough public attention to jeopardize the social license of the industry. In other words, where a campaign is simply effective as a democratic campaign. In response, Monahan and Walby describe what they call a state corporate symbiosis, or a petro-security apparatus, where security services and major energy corporations work as security peers. They share information, all with the view to undermining whatever protest or disruption is being carried out. For evidence of their argument, the authors point to many different examples, including two from Montreal, which I'm sure those of you from Montreal will be aware of. 2011, there was a man from here who was charged with anti-terrorist laws for writing letters. There are also documents released in 2013 which showed that the RCMP had been monitoring Quebec residents who were involved in anti-fracking campaigns. So this is nothing violent that was going on. These are citizen groups. These are NGOs involved in anti-fracking demonstrations who are being monitored. The authors spend a great deal of time also talking about the Enridge Gateway pipeline. Again, if you're from here, you're probably familiar with this issue. If not, my very basic summary would be there are two pipelines traveling east to west. On the one direction, importing natural gas, whereas the westbound line was exporting diluted bitumen. The project was widely opposed by environmental groups, by the NDP in BC, and also by First Nations people. There were a group of over 100 First Nations groups, for example, that signed declarations against the pipeline, specifically being concerned that it was going through unceded territory. So they're very legitimate concerns that people are voicing. Working behind the scenes, the RCMP and the Canadian Security Intelligence Services worked with the National Energy Board, energy corporations, including Enbridge, and several private security businesses. And they would hold joint meetings, they would share intelligence, and work together to disrupt the protests that were going on. Most of the information that was being shared by these various groups related to what the authors describe as imagined threats. So these are examples where a private security firm might exaggerate a potential risk, or those kind of situations, but it was also just everyone's data. It was personal communication, it was people's politics, everything was swept in to what was being captured and shared by these groups. Monahan and Walby, one of the things they've been able to quite successfully do is gain access through freedom of information to a great trove of documents, and their articles are detailing a lot of this. These documents describe meetings where representatives from the police, intelligence, and security companies praise the economic benefits and the safety of the pipeline. So these are not neutral positions that security, police, and intelligence organizations are viewing this project from. They describe opponents, this is a direct quote from one of the documents, as antisocial deviants, upset First Nations, unreasonable environmentalists, and complainers. And I will... I'll skip over some stuff here, but there is also, if you go through the documents, it's very clearly talking about how private and government are working together, how they're sharing information, how they're working, which I think is quite an unnerving development. There's obviously much more that could be said even just about the Enbridge case, and Monaghan and Walby have also looked at the infiltration and spying of the Idle No More movement in Canada, so directly targeting First Nations groups. And I said I wasn't going to talk about the US, but I just couldn't help but mention, I was reading in the Associated Press last week, a case about the Dakota Access Pipeline, where Energy Transfer Partners directly wired $15 million to help cover law enforcement. So it's just such a naked relationship between security and the private sector. It's not even a veneer of cover. Turning to Australia, it should be said from the beginning that these relationships between government, intelligence, and the private sector are far less well understood. There's conversations, there's been some basic reporting on it, but we don't have the kind of documents, the smoking gun that Canadian researchers have been able to produce. We do know that our countries share similar histories in attacking subversive movements. We're also both members of the Five Eyes Security Alliance with the United States as well. So there's every reason to think that we're engaging in similar kinds of work. What little evidence we do have comes from very good and quite brave reporting in the mainstream media. In particular, the Sydney Morning Herald in Australia has been leading a lot of the investigative journalism on this. So there are a couple of examples. The first from 2009, we had a federal energy minister, Martin Ferguson, who's after leaving government went to work for the mining industry, incidentally. He argued that ASIO, so our federal intelligence agency, had a responsibility to take measures to protect Australia's coal infrastructure. So putting that responsibility directly into ASIO's court. While our anti-coal movement has had a very long commitment to non-violence, Ferguson justified ASIO's involvement. Here's his quote: protests could have life-threatening consequences if services were disrupted and major trade investment implications. So I want to return to that language in a second. So just again, it's life-threatening consequences if service was disrupted and major trade and investment consequences. They're the key items that justify the involvement of ASIO. Adding to this comment, Philip Dorling, who's a journalist, obtained documents which stated that the environmental activists pose greater threats to energy infrastructure than terrorists. And this is a common piece of rhetoric that gets thrown around in Australia all the time. The rhetoric that the government uses is worth scrutinising. Ferguson is trying to deploy images of distressed citizens unable to use their air conditioner during an Australian heat wave to justify secret and intrusive surveillance of a non-violent movement. It's equally revealing that Ferguson sees the government as having an equal responsibility to protect trade and investment. This language absolutely mirrors the rhetoric of critical infrastructure protection, which gets used here in Canada, and In both instances, the government is positioning themselves as having a unique responsibility to protect the right of corporations to unimpeded market access, and actions which jeopardize this access can be criminalized, rendered legally impossible, or just politically attacked. More recently, in 2014, Tom Allard, also reporting in the Sydney Morning Herald, broke a news story about spying against landowners and anti-coal activists who were campaigning to stop 2 coal mines in New South Wales. So again, this is landowners predominantly, and working with anti-coal activists. In this example, there was a mining company called Idemitsu, which hired 2 private companies to infiltrate, collect information, and inform on landowners and protest groups. To overly simplify this case, the 2 people employed were Tony Groves, who was a former Australian military intelligence officer, and Maria Tope, who was also had a background in intelligence. The pair posed as activists, put on their Rastafarian hats and dirty t-shirts and tried to blend in as best they could, collected information and reported back directly. They were particularly bad at their job and were caught. You can go onto YouTube and see the footage of them being confronted. But it is funny, but there's also been lots of cases where either private security people or people in government go into these groups, form relationships, even have children with people in the movement. And this really blew up in the United Kingdom. You can find websites of support groups for women who have been found out that these people they've had children with were spies. It's really quite horrible, yucky stuff. Returning to my example in New South Wales, journalists weren't able to directly link this case back to ASIO or the Federal Police, but the documents that they have received report a third party who's described as an ultimate client that was supporting the operations behind the scenes, providing additional intelligence, but there's no direct smoking gun that links this case back to the government. Whatever the case though, it's unlikely that this bit of reporting we've had from New South Wales is a one-off event. And we do know that the security business, the private security business in Australia is expanding, and they're drawing people who used to work in the Australian intelligence community. These people, once leaving the Australian intelligence community, have received lucrative work, taking up positions in Iraq and Afghanistan. But as those wars have dwindled down, they've returned to Australia and are employing some of the techniques and skills they've developed overseas against peaceful movements inside of Australia. So at this stage, there's a great need for further research in Australia and in Canada to document these cases and to understand the relationships and the networks. There's a really interesting book by Evelyn Lubbers, who really kick-started this work off in the UK called Secret Maneuvers in the Dark. And she's certainly calling for a research project that does this. And as I said, I'm currently working with a bunch of people in Australia. These are activists, academics, people in Cockwatch programs and the like, to collect information and data. And we're making and being denied freedom of information requests. There's a lot of protections that are stopping us getting good information. But to conclude, given the critical role that movements play in any transition to a better society, it's really important that we understand the tangible forces that are preventing momentum from being made. And we need to force governments, I think, to listen to the grievances that are being voiced by everyday people and not just see every concern through the prism, it's quite a paranoid prism of terrorism and subversion. That's not understanding where movements are coming from at all. Thank you.
Quite intriguing, I must say. You have questions? Are there questions?
I have a quick one. I'll speak up even though I'm sitting right next to you. So thank you, Peter. It was an excellent paper. And as someone who's involved in various activities in Australia, in the environmental movement, we were aware of it. But it's very scary, isn't it? I'm just wondering how much your work either has looked at or is connected to, is it Will Potter, Green is the New Black? Some of the work that he's done in activists challenging factory farming and hideous agriculture. I mean, there seems to be some pretty horrific treatment of their activists too. Is it the same space, or are you kind of in a different area just because you're looking at different resistance?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess the short answer is it's not. We haven't been in direct contact, but you're absolutely right. It's covering lots of similar territory, and similar moves have been done to cast animal rights activists as terrorists. The same language is used. It's astonishingly uncreative in some ways.
Quite scary what they're doing in the US, putting folks, they were finding animal activists in cells that were worse than they actually put so-called real terrorists into.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, I also think it's so interesting how people who go into a factory farm, for example, and there was a case that Glenn Greenwald reported on in The Intercept last week, where they took a young baby pig that was going to be...
2 little pigs?
Maybe it was 2.
2 little pigs,
yeah.
I saw that story.
And they were cast as terrorists, as thieves.
Yeah.
And it's been incredible how that language has been able to get traction in the context of a machinery built around the mass-scale killing of animals.
I know.
And
they took the little pigs because they were just close to death. I thought
exactly.
might save them.
Exactly.
And,
I think the mother had already died or something.
She'd fallen on them all. Oh,
it definitely covers similar.
It's terrifying. So,
We have time for one question.
More comments. Another aspect, at least in Canada, that I'm very aware of following because of my focus on mining, is support for mining companies that are linked to human rights abuses and horrible violence. In Latin America, there's quite the epidemic. Some groups looking at this in Canada call it the criminalization of dissent. And the number, there's a very famous murder of Cáceres in Honduras, was it like 2 years ago?
Yeah.
So, but there are many. Apparently, I think the number of land defenders who have been murdered across the world this year is something like 150 a year, way up there. So, but governments are supporting these companies, and like foreign affairs ministries are directly supporting these companies, and embassies in Mexico, for example, have helped Canadian mining companies that are having trouble with the local population, and help the police and help Honduras write their mining law. So